Have you ever wondered what it takes to stand alone at the edge of the world, where land meets an endless churning abyss, where the only thing between you and absolute darkness is a single beam of light that you must keep burning no matter what? Tonight we're venturing into the isolated, wind-battered realm of lighthouse keepers, those forgotten souls who chose, or were forced to endure months, sometimes years, of crushing solitude in some of the most remote and unforgiving locations on Earth. But this isn't just a story about loneliness or the relentless pounding of waves against ancient stone. No, what we're about to uncover goes far deeper, far darker, into territories where the human mind begins to fracture, where the boundaries between the living and the dead grow dangerously thin, and where things that should not exist make their presence horrifyingly known. You see, lighthouses have always represented safety and guidance for sailors navigating treacherous waters, their revolving beacons cutting through fog and storm to warn of hidden rocks and deadly shoals. But for the men and women who maintained these structures, the reality was often quite different. These towering sentinels were frequently built on barren rocks, miles from civilization, accessible only during brief windows of calm weather, leaving their keepers stranded for weeks or months at a time, with nothing but the howling wind, the crashing surf, and their own increasingly unstable thoughts for company. The psychological toll of such extreme isolation cannot be overstated. Imagine being cut off from every human comfort, every familiar face, every reassuring sound of normal life, forced instead to exist in a realm of constant noise from the elements, yet profound silence from human connection. It's no wonder, then, that lighthouses became breeding grounds for tragedy, madness, and encounters with forces that defy rational explanation. And while the mysterious disappearance of 3 keepers from the Flannan Isles lighthouse remains one of the most haunting maritime mysteries ever recorded, other incidents have proven equally disturbing, even when we know exactly what happened to those involved. Take, for instance, the horrifying events that unfolded at the Smalls Lighthouse off the coast of Pembrokeshire, Wales, during the bitter winter of 1801. This particular lighthouse stood on a wave-swept rock formation 22 miles from the nearest land, an utterly desolate posting where 2 keepers were assigned to maintain the light in alternating shifts. Now, these 2 men, whose names have been lost to history but whose ordeal certainly hasn't, were known throughout the local maritime community for their volatile relationship. They argued constantly, their personalities clashing like the waves against their isolated rock. And their mutual hatred was no secret to the port authorities or the sailors who occasionally delivered supplies. So, when one of these keepers died suddenly of natural causes in the middle of a particularly savage winter storm, his surviving colleague found himself in an absolutely nightmarish predicament. You have to understand the situation. Here was a man trapped on a tiny rock with the corpse of someone he'd publicly feuded with, knowing full well that when a rescue boat finally arrived, which could be weeks or even months given the weather, he might very well be accused of murder. After all, who would believe that his enemy had simply died of natural causes when they were alone together in the middle of nowhere? The surviving keeper, paralyzed by this fear and perhaps not thinking entirely clearly given his isolation and shock, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Rather than committing his colleague's body to the sea in a makeshift burial, which would have been the normal and humane thing to do, he instead constructed a crude wooden coffin, sealed the corpse inside, and lashed the entire thing to the exterior railing of the lighthouse platform. His reasoning, such as it was that this would preserve the body as evidence of his innocence, proof that he hadn't harmed his fellow keeper. But the sea and wind had other plans. Night after night, as storms continued to batter the lighthouse, the makeshift coffin was subjected to tremendous forces. The wood began to crack and splinter, the bindings started to loosen, and eventually, inevitably, the casket broke apart. And this is where the keeper's situation transformed from merely tragic to absolutely soul-destroying. The corpse, now partially exposed to the elements and beginning to decompose in the salt air, remained lashed to the railing, but its arms had come free and now hung down, dangling in the wind. And with each gust, with each roll of the lighthouse in the heavy seas, those dead arms would swing and scrape across the windows of the keeper's quarters. Imagine it, alone in the dark, trying to sleep, trying to maintain some fragment of sanity and hearing that constant scratching, that persistent tapping of dead fingers against glass, knowing that just beyond that fragile barrier was the rotting corpse of your former colleague, seeming almost to beckon you, to call you out into the storm and into death itself. The psychological torture went on for weeks. Passing ships reported seeing distress signals from the lighthouse, desperate pleas for rescue. But the weather simply wouldn't allow any vessel to approach the rock safely. The keeper was trapped with his macabre companion, slowly losing his grip on reality, becoming convinced in his deteriorating mental state that the corpse wasn't simply being moved by the wind, but was actively trying to reach him, to drag him down into death as well. When rescuers finally managed to reach the lighthouse after the winter gales subsided, they found a man who had aged years in mere weeks. His hair reportedly gone white, his eyes wild and haunted, barely able to speak coherently about his ordeal. The incident became legendary in lighthouse-keeping circles, and cautionary tales so disturbing that it prompted authorities to change their policies, ensuring that no lighthouse would ever again be manned by fewer than 3 keepers, so that if one died, the survivors could serve as witnesses for each other. But the Smalls lighthouse was far from the only place where such horrors unfolded. Half a century later, and across the Atlantic Ocean, another tragedy would play out on Boone Island, a barren pile of rocks jutting from the frigid waters off the coast of Maine, approximately 6 miles from the town of York. This desolate location had earned a fearsome reputation among sailors. Numerous ships had foundered on its hidden shoals, their crews perishing in the icy waters before help could arrive. In 1855, recognizing the urgent need to prevent further loss of life, the United States Army Corps of Engineers was commissioned to construct a lighthouse on this inhospitable rock. The project was dangerous and difficult, with workers constantly battling the elements, but eventually a sturdy granite tower was erected. Its light first kindled to guide vessels safely past the deadly shoals. Over the following years, various keepers came and went from this isolated posting, most lasting only a single season before requesting transfer to less demanding stations. The isolation was profound, the conditions brutal, and the constant roar of surf against rock was said to drive men to distraction. But in the winter of 1856, a young couple arrived who seemed different from the previous keepers. Lucas Bright was an experienced lightkeeper, a capable and dedicated man who took his responsibilities seriously, and he'd recently married a young woman named Kathleen, whose love for her husband was so strong that she'd agreed to accompany him to this lonely outpost, despite warnings from others about the harsh conditions they'd face. For the first few months, everything seemed to go well. The couple settled into their routines, with Lucas managing the technical aspects of lighthouse maintenance, while Kathleen kept their small cottage as comfortable as possible given their circumstances. They seemed genuinely happy, finding joy in each other's company despite their isolation. But then, in early December, disaster struck with cruel swiftness. During a particularly violent winter storm, Lucas realized that the lamp's oil reservoir was running dangerously low and would need to be refilled before nightfall if the light was to continue burning through the long hours of darkness ahead. It was a routine task, one he'd performed countless times before. But the weather that day was especially treacherous, with massive waves periodically sweeping across the entire island. Kathleen watched from the cottage window as her husband made his way carefully across the slick rocks toward the lighthouse tower, fighting against wind that threatened to knock him off his feet. She saw him reach the tower's base and begin to relax, thinking the dangerous part of his journey was over. But then, without warning, a rogue wave, one of those massive, unpredictable walls of water that seemed to come from nowhere, crashed over the island with devastating force. Kathleen screamed as she saw her husband swept off his feet and dragged backward toward the churning sea. Without a moment's hesitation, acting purely on desperate love and instinct, she grabbed a coil of rope from inside the cottage, tied one end securely around her own waist and the other to a heavy iron fixture, and dove headlong into the freezing, violent water after her husband. The cold was like 1,000 knives stabbing into her flesh. The current was impossibly strong, and the waves kept pushing her under. But she fought with every ounce of strength she possessed, swimming in the direction she'd last seen Lucas. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few men. They heard footsteps moving through the cottage at night when they were certain they were alone. Heard soft crying that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, and experienced the unnerving sensation of being watched by sympathetic, sorrowful eyes. Many reported feeling a presence in the lighthouse tower itself, as if someone else was there helping to maintain the light. A gentle, feminine presence that seemed to radiate both sadness and protective devotion. One particular keeper named David Wells, who was stationed at Boone Island during the 1970s, more than a century after Kathleen's death, reported an incident that sent chills down the spines of everyone who heard it. Wells and his colleague had been allowed to keep a pet Labrador retriever at the lighthouse for companionship, as was sometimes permitted at more isolated stations. But from the moment the dog arrived on the island, it behaved strangely. The normally friendly and obedient animal became visibly agitated whenever it was inside the cottage, refusing to settle, whining constantly, and fixating on empty spaces as if seeing something its human companions couldn't perceive. On multiple occasions, Wells witnessed the dog entering unoccupied rooms and immediately beginning to snarl and growl, its hackles raised, its attention focused on what appeared to be absolutely nothing. Except, Wells began to suspect it wasn't nothing at all. The dog seemed to be tracking something invisible moving around the room, its head following this unseen presence, its body tense and ready to either attack or flee. Even more disturbing were the incidents that occurred outside the cottage. Several times, both keepers watched in bewilderment as their dog suddenly took off at a dead sprint across the rocks, chasing something they couldn't see, barking furiously, and then cornering this invisible quarry and attacking empty air before suddenly yelping in apparent fear and racing back to the cottage as if being pursued in turn. Wells eventually requested a transfer, unable to cope with the constant eerie occurrences, and the dog was removed from the island after it became completely unmanageable. But Kathleen Bright's story, tragic and moving as it is, represents only one type of lighthouse horror: the sorrowful, sympathetic haunting of a devoted soul unable to let go. Other lighthouses harbored far more malevolent presences, entities that seemed actively hostile to human presence and determined to drive away or destroy anyone who dared to intrude upon their territory. Perhaps nowhere was this more evident than at the Thévenet Lighthouse, situated on a small rocky island among a treacherous group of shoals known as the Raz de Seine, off the coast of Brittany in northwestern France. For centuries, these waters had claimed countless vessels, ships smashed to pieces on hidden rocks, their crews drowning in the cold Atlantic swells or disappearing into the numerous caves that honeycombed the islands. So many sailors met their end in these waters that local folklore insisted the islands must be cursed. Gateways to hell itself, where the souls of the drowned were dragged down into eternal torment. The legends spoke of death, personified dwelling among these rocks, of phantom lights that lured ships to their doom, of terrible voices that called to sailors in the darkness, promising safe harbor but delivering only destruction. When the French maritime authorities finally decided, in the 1870s, that a lighthouse must be constructed to prevent further tragedies, they had tremendous difficulty finding a construction crew willing to work on Thévenet Island itself. The locals insisted it was damned ground, that building there would only anger whatever dark forces held dominion over that cursed rock. But eventually, with enough money and probably enough official pressure, construction began, and after several difficult years plagued by accidents, injuries, and workers who fled the project claiming they'd seen or heard terrible things, the Thévenet Lighthouse was finally completed and activated in 1875. Finding keepers willing to man this isolated station proved even more difficult than building it had been. The contract offered by the government was admittedly generous in terms of pay, but it came with a significant catch. Applicants had to commit to a full year of service completely alone on the island, with supplies delivered periodically, but no option to leave until their contract was fulfilled. The first man brave or desperate enough to accept these terms was a fellow named Henri Guézenec, a former sailor who'd spent years at sea and figured that keeping a lighthouse couldn't possibly be worse than some of the things he'd endured aboard ship. How wrong he would prove to be. Guézenec moved to the island, and began his solitary tenure. Initially feeling quite comfortable with the isolation, he'd always been something of a loner, preferring his own company to that of others. And he found the routine work of lighthouse maintenance to be straightforward and even somewhat meditative. But after only a few weeks, things began to happen that shattered his peace of mind. It started with voices. At night, as he lay in his bed trying to sleep, he began to hear murmuring sounds drifting through the darkness outside his cottage. At first, he dismissed it as the wind playing tricks, creating sounds that resembled human speech the way wind sometimes does. But as the nights went on, the voices became clearer, more distinct, and he could make out actual words being spoken in various languages. Some in Breton, the regional language of Brittany, others in Flemish, and still others in languages he didn't recognize at all. But regardless of the language, the message seemed to be the same. Warnings that the island was cursed, that he must leave immediately, that terrible things would happen to him if he remained, that he would share the fate of all the other souls who'd died in these waters. Gazanek, despite being thoroughly unnerved, was a practical man who'd signed a contract and had no intention of forfeiting his pay by abandoning his post. So he did his best to ignore the voices, telling himself they were hallucinations brought on by isolation and the constant sound of waves. When the supply boat arrived several weeks later, however, the sailors immediately noticed that something was wrong with the keeper. He looked haggard and exhausted, and he made the mistake of mentioning the voices to the boat's captain. Word quickly got back to the port authorities, who summoned Gezenek and, after hearing his account, sternly ordered him not to speak of these matters to anyone else, particularly not to potential replacement keepers. They couldn't afford to have the reputation of Tevenek become even worse than it already was, or they'd never find anyone willing to work there. But keeping the incidents quiet didn't make them stop. Gezenek somehow managed to complete his year-long contract, though he emerged from the experience a changed man, nervous and haunted. His replacement, a man named Miliao, lasted barely 6 weeks before the supply boat arrived to find him waiting frantically at the island's small dock. Wild-eyed and manic, desperately begging to be taken back to the mainland immediately and refusing to spend even one more night on the accursed rock. Once he was calmed down, Miliao explained that he'd experienced exactly what his predecessor had: the murmuring voices outside at night, speaking in multiple languages, but always delivering the same warnings and threats. But in Miliao's case, the phenomenon had escalated. The voices, which had initially remained outside his cottage, had gradually grown louder and seemed to penetrate through the walls, until he could hear them clearly inside his bedroom, whispering all around him in the darkness. Sometimes sounding like dozens or even hundreds of distinct speakers, all talking at once, creating a horrifying cacophony of threats and warnings that made sleep impossible. Miliao absolutely refused to return to the island, and the authorities, facing a serious problem, decided to try a different approach. Instead of a single keeper, they would assign 2 men to Tevenek, figuring that having companionship would help maintain psychological stability, and that the two could support each other through whatever strange experiences occurred. This seemed to work better, at least initially, and several pairs of keepers managed to complete their contracts without incident, or at least without anything so terrible that they refused to continue. But then the deaths began. One keeper was found lying dead in the lamp room at the top of the lighthouse tower, his body showing no signs of injury or illness, no explanation whatsoever for why his heart had simply stopped. Another keeper, a man named Melipe, failed to come down for breakfast one morning, and when his colleague went to check on him, he found Melipe dead in his bed, his eyes wide open and staring in absolute terror at the ceiling, his arms raised stiffly as if he'd been trying to ward off some attacker. Though the room was locked from the inside, and there was no sign of any intruder or any struggle. As word of these deaths spread, it became increasingly difficult to find anyone willing to accept assignment to Tevenek, and the authorities were forced to become less selective in their hiring, accepting men who were perhaps not entirely suitable for such demanding work. A former sailor named Rupa, desperate for employment, agreed to take the position on the condition that he could bring his elderly, bedridden father to the island to live with him. as he had no one else to care for the old man. The authorities, having few other options, reluctantly agreed. But Rupar's father, from his very first night on the island, complained to his son that there were shadows in his iwaush. It had been the responsibility of the Uruguayan military to maintain the facility, with small detachments of Navy personnel assigned to live on the island for 2-week rotations. In late October of 1972, the team currently stationed at the island was under the command of Naval Captain Francisco Cascuda, an experienced and level-headed officer who led a crew of 4 enlisted men. On the evening of October 28th, the captain and his men had all been relaxing in the recreation room of their quarters after completing the day's maintenance tasks, watching television and enjoying what passed for leisure time in their isolated posting. Standard procedure dictated that the facility's backup generators needed to be checked at 10 o'clock every evening to ensure they would be ready in case of a power failure. And that night, this routine task was assigned to Corporal Juan Fuentes, a young but reliable non-commissioned officer. Fuentes left the main building and began walking across the compound toward the generator shed. But he'd barely taken a dozen steps when he stopped abruptly, his attention caught by something utterly inexplicable. There were lights playing across the roof of the generator building, brilliant beams of white, yellow, and violet that swept and swirled in patterns that made no logical sense. Fuentes' first thought was that somehow a vehicle's headlights were reflecting off the building, but he immediately realized how impossible that was. They were on an isolated island with no vehicles, and there were no boats close enough to the shore to cast such bright light. His hand dropped instinctively to the holster where his service pistol rested, and as his eyes adjusted to the darkness and the strange illumination, he saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Perched on the flat roof of the generator building, approximately 6 meters above the ground, was a small craft unlike anything Fuentes had ever seen. Not a helicopter, not a conventional aircraft, but something utterly alien in its design and appearance. The lights he'd seen were emanating from this object, which hovered silently above the roof with no visible means of propulsion. No rotor blades, no exhaust plumes, nothing that would explain how it was staying aloft. And moving beneath this craft, illuminated by its strange multicolored lights, were 3 figures. They appeared to be humanoid in general shape, but they were smaller than average humans, perhaps only 5 feet tall, and they were wearing what looked like tight-fitting black suits, similar to diving gear, smooth and reflective. Their heads seemed oddly proportioned, larger and more elongated than normal human heads, as if they were wearing bulbous helmets. Though Fuentes couldn't make out any facial features clearly because of the way the light reflected off whatever covered their heads. The 3 figures were moving around the roof with purpose, apparently performing some kind of work on or around their craft, and Fuentes had the distinct impression that they were conducting repairs or maintenance of some kind. Then one of the figures noticed him. The being froze in place, and then all 3 of them turned to look directly at the corporal, who was standing perhaps 30 meters away. Fuentes, his military training overriding his shock, stepped forward and raised his pistol, drawing a bead on the nearest figure. But as he did so, something absolutely bizarre happened. He felt a sudden, powerful shock surge through his body, like a bolt of electricity shooting up from the ground through his legs and torso, though he hadn't touched anything and there was no visible source for this sensation. His outstretched arm, the one holding the pistol, began to tremble uncontrollably, shaking so violently that he couldn't keep his aim steady. And he felt all the hairs on his body standing on end. That peculiar prickling sensation you get during a lightning storm. Even more disturbing, he felt a strange thought entering his mind, a conviction that seemed to be placed there from outside himself rather than arising from his own reasoning. The absolute certainty that firing his weapon would be pointless, that the bullets would have no effect on these beings, that attempting to shoot would only bring harm to himself. Whether this was some kind of telepathic communication, a technologically induced suggestion, or simply his own subconscious mind reacting to an overwhelming situation, Fuentes couldn't say, but the feeling was powerful and undeniable. As he stood there, paralyzed, the 3 figures moved with sudden urgency, scrambling back up into their craft with remarkable speed and agility. Within seconds, they disappeared inside the object, and then the craft itself began to change. It started vibrating, the lights intensified, and then it simply lifted straight up from the roof without any sound of engines, without any blast of air or exhaust, rising smoothly and rapidly into the night sky. Once it had cleared the rooftops of the facility, it suddenly accelerated to an incredible speed and shot away toward the Uruguayan mainland, covering the distance to the horizon in just a few seconds before vanishing completely. In the moment it disappeared, Fuentes found that he could move again, the paralysis and the strange electrical sensation releasing him all at once. He immediately ran back to the main building, burst into the recreation room where his colleagues were still watching television in peaceful ignorance, and breathlessly began explaining what he'd just witnessed. Captain Cascuda, to his credit, took his corporal's report seriously. He ordered all 5 men to conduct a thorough search of the generator building roof and the surrounding area, looking for any physical evidence of the craft or its occupants. Burn marks, footprints, discarded equipment, anything at all. But despite examining every centimeter of the area with flashlights, they found absolutely nothing unusual. No trace that anything had landed there, or that anyone had been walking around on that roof. Cascuda made a detailed entry in his official duty log, noting the date, time, and Fuentes' account of the incident, and then thought little more about it, assuming this would simply become one of those strange reports that gets filed away and forgotten. But several days later, after their rotation ended and they returned to the mainland, Captain Cascuda was unexpectedly summoned to meet with his superior officers. At this meeting, he was questioned extensively about the incident, asked to recount every detail of what Corporal Fuentes had reported, and then, most surprisingly, he and Fuentes were both instructed to accompany a naval intelligence officer to the American embassy in Montevideo. At the embassy, they spent several hours in a closed-door session with what Fuentes later described as a mix of American military personnel and civilian officials, possibly intelligence operatives. They were asked to repeat their account multiple times, to draw detailed sketches of the craft and the beings they'd seen, to describe every aspect of the encounter down to the smallest detail. The Americans listened carefully, took extensive notes, asked thoughtful and very specific questions that suggested they'd heard similar accounts before, and then thanked the 2 Uruguayans for their cooperation and dismissed them with instructions not to discuss the incident publicly. In the years that followed, Captain Cascuda, who eventually retired from military service, made discreet inquiries whenever possible about that October night, trying to find out if his government or the Americans had ever determined what it was that Corporal Fuentes had encountered. The answer he received from various official and unofficial sources was always the same. Neither the Uruguayan Navy nor the United States government had any idea what the craft was or where it had come from, but they had absolutely no reason to doubt the credibility of the witness. Fuentes was a trained military observer. He'd been sober and on duty, he'd reported the incident immediately, and there were no contradictions or obvious impossibilities in his account. Something had landed on that island. Something had been there performing some kind of maintenance or repairs, and then it had left. What it was, where it came from, and why it chose that particular location remain complete mysteries to this day. So what are we to make of all these lighthouse incidents? What threads connect these disparate tales of corpses, lashed to railings, tragic drownings, whispering voices, malevolent presences, and even apparent alien encounters? The obvious common factor is isolation. That crushing, mind-breaking loneliness that comes from being cut off from normal human society for extended periods. It's well documented that extreme isolation can cause hallucinations, paranoia, and various forms of psychological breakdown. And certainly that could explain many of the reported phenomena, particularly the voices heard at Taverneck, or the surviving keeper's belief that his dead colleague was beckoning him at Smalls. The human mind, starved for stimulation and companionship, begins to create its own stimuli, projecting internal psychological content onto the external environment and interpreting random sensory input as meaningful patterns. That's a perfectly reasonable, scientific explanation. And it probably accounts for at least some of what these keepers experienced. But does it account for everything? What about the cases where multiple witnesses reported the same phenomena? Like the various keepers at Tevenek, all hearing voices speaking the same warnings? What about the dog at Boone Island, apparently reacting to something invisible? When animals presumably wouldn't be subject to the same isolation-induced hallucinations as humans? And what about Corporal Fuentes' encounter, which occurred not during a long period of isolation, but during a routine 2-week rotation with 4 other men present, and which had physical effects? The electrical sensation, the paralysis, that seemed to go beyond mere hallucination? Perhaps the isolation served a different purpose in some of these cases. Perhaps, rather than causing the phenomena directly through psychological breakdown, the isolation simply exposed the keepers to things that are always present, but usually go unnoticed in the bustle and distraction of normal life. When you're alone in the darkness on a windswept rock far from civilization, with nothing to distract you from your immediate environment, maybe you become more sensitive to presences and forces that most of us never perceive. Maybe the dead do linger in certain places, unable or unwilling to move on. And maybe entities do exist that are hostile to human presence and prefer remote locations where they can dwell undisturbed. And maybe, just maybe, intelligences from elsewhere do occasionally visit our world and, needing to conduct repairs or gather resources or simply explore, choose isolated locations where they think they'll be unobserved and won't cause panic. The lighthouse keepers, by the very nature of their work, were stationed in exactly such isolated locations, and so they became inadvertent witnesses to things that the rest of us, safe in our cities and towns, never encounter. As we move further into the 21st century, and more of these lighthouses become fully automated, as the need for resident keepers disappears entirely, and these structures are maintained by periodic visits from technicians who spend perhaps a few hours on site before leaving, we're losing something important. We're losing the detailed, long-term observations that come from people actually living in these places for extended periods. If strange phenomena occur at automated lighthouses now, there's no one there to witness them. No one to report the whispers in the darkness, or the figures moving on the rocks, or the unexplained lights in the sky, the mysteries that the old keepers documented, the incidents they reported, and that we've preserved in their logbooks and their testimony. Those will simply fade away, becoming nothing more than legends, nautical tall tales told in seaside bars and dismissed as superstition, or the ravings of men driven mad by isolation. We'll never know for certain what really happened at places like Smalls, or Tevenek, or Isla de Lobos. Never be able to prove whether these were genuine encounters with the supernatural or the alien, or whether they were indeed nothing more than the predictable psychological consequences of extreme isolation. And perhaps that uncertainty, that permanent ambiguity, is fitting. The sea has always been a realm of mystery, a vast and largely unexplored wilderness that holds secrets in its depths and on its isolated shores. The lighthouse keepers, those solitary guardians of the boundary between land and water, between light and darkness, between the known and the unknown, were perhaps uniquely positioned to encounter those mysteries. Their stories, whether we choose to believe them as literal truth or to dismiss them as folklore, add to the rich tapestry of maritime legend, reminding us that there is still much in this world that we don't understand. Still places where the comfortable certainties of modern life fall away, and we're forced to confront the possibility that reality is stranger, darker and more wondrous than we usually imagine. So the next time you see a lighthouse, standing solitary and stalwart against the waves, its beacon cutting through the darkness to guide sailors safely home, spare a thought for those who maintained these lights in the years before automation, those brave or desperate souls who endured months or years of isolation in some of the most remote and unforgiving locations on Earth. Remember their sacrifices, their tragedies, and yes, their strange encounters with forces that defied explanation. They kept the lights burning so that others might live. And in doing so, they became witnesses to mysteries that we're still trying to understand today. And perhaps, on certain dark and stormy nights, when the wind howls and the waves crash against ancient stone, those old keepers are still there at their posts, still maintaining their eternal vigil, watching and waiting at the edge of the world, where the known meets the unknown under the beacon's glare.